Cool. Hey, disclaimer, wildly unprepared for this, but I'm hoping that you guys can ask questions as I go, and we can go on this journey together. My name is David Novicki. I am VP of Engineering at a small startup here in Sacramento. We do everything in Redux, JavaScript, well, JavaScript of course, but Node, MongoDB, you name it. And newly, service workers, which I find very fascinating. Also kind of a weird barrier to entry to kind of understanding service workers, and one, as a newer developer or someone who doesn't have any experience with them, why you would even use them, and also how to go about using them. So here I put a little quote, and this is exactly how I felt when I started going to service workers, is why the hell would I use the service worker? I have nothing right now that I feel that I need to use it, so sell me on it, right? In a nutshell, it's just a JavaScript file that can run in the background. Okay, so it's very simple. Now debugging and going about the whole process is another deal, and we'll go through that. But all you need to know is we load a JavaScript file and we run it in the background. A little bit more on that. It runs in a separate thread, which, in JavaScript, that's huge, right? We're single-threaded. Although we have the event loop, there's certain things that maybe we want to separate, or maybe need their own CPU power, and we want to keep that away. So it kind of gives us some options there. The other thing is it's actually shared between tabs. So we can have this service worker running, and it can hold its own state or its own information, and it can be the same across the board. Thirdly, it's right now it's primarily used mostly as a proxy for network requests, which is something new, at least for me in JavaScript and dealing with RESTful API calls and stuff like that. It's kind of a middleman in between that, which is really cool, and we'll get into that. But again, why? Like I said, main threads, reduce the main thread's workload. Something that's reoccurring or taxing and needs to sit in the background. We can separate that completely. Offline capabilities, which is kind of an oxymoron when you're talking about the internet, but there's a lot of really cool applications you can do with service workers to make your web app work almost 100% offline for some periods of time. Web push technology, which is like push notifications that you get in a mobile app. There's actually browser implementations through Chrome and Firefox. And lastly, background sync. This is a really, to me, it's a very new idea, and I think it's really cool. It's the idea that if you lose connection, you can hold on to a lot of that information that you wanted to send up to the API, and as soon as you get back connection, you can sync back up to the API and send it up then. So it allows that kind of periodic online-offline feel. And that's the reality of being on your phone on a web app today. Is you're on cellular, you're moving across service and no service, and it's not always you just have a slow connection. You have a good connection sometimes, and then all of a sudden you'll have a bad connection and you'll flip right back. So very unique case that a lot of times we don't think about. There is some caveats. Must be served over HTTPS. I think that's a good thing. I wouldn't change it. The browser manages a service worker, so you have to write code that doesn't rely on the service worker for everything, right? It's a helper. It's an assistant. You have to assume that it's sometimes not there. It has no access to things like the DOM or local storage or cookies. So there's various particular use cases for service workers, and you cannot do anything regarding those. Again, you may lose your mind debugging. Debugging service workers, if anyone's ever done it, it is right now it'll drive you crazy. And I'll go through some of the tips to help you guys with that. And then finally, it's really still an early stage. So a lot of us aren't using service workers today because it is new. It's not supported on all browsers. There's a lot that kind of goes into looking at where it's at now and where it's going. So A lot of the bigger companies are adopting it, but knowing that they're going to have to possibly change or evolve as service workers go. I do think it's here to stay, and I hope it's here to stay as well. Cool, so this is the red X of death for support. Because it's early, it's considered progressive. It's only supported by really Chrome and Firefox. Edge, no surprise there. Internet Explorer, definitely not. But there's talks about them possibly supporting it. Now, that doesn't really mean anything in our age, but yeah.
What are the numbers?
Oh, can you not see them?
No, why are they like 40 or 59? What do they mean?
Oh, those are version numbers.
Oh, okay.
So all the way back to Chrome 40 is when they started basic support. Firefox is 44. But this is kind of a roadmap of where we're at now. It shows you where you can use it. And again, another reason why don't support 100% on service workers. Use them as an assistance. Use them to add value to your application, but not be the value to your entire application. So service workers have life cycles. Essentially, you download them, you install them, and then they activate. Okay. If they error pretty silently. Not really much of an issue. Sometimes, actually, when you're coding in this or you're trying to figure out issues, they error too silently. And we're going to cover that. And then they'll kind of just like sit idle. And the tricky part is the browser will sometimes kill your service worker. And then it'll reboot up a new one when you open the window again. And you have to write code to assume that you're never going to know when that's going to happen. So we write certain things on install and activate hooks that do some due diligence to make sure that we pick back up where we might have left off, right? At any time, we don't know where we left off. And we'll get into those events. But most importantly, it works also with a fetch hook. So how many people in the audience have used fetch, the fetch HTTP client in the browser? Not very many, right? Like, reality is probably all you guys are using it right now, and you don't know it. So in Chrome especially, a lot of the fallbacks for getting images and JavaScript files are actually using fetch. They're actually taking XHR or XML requests, and they've created kind of an API that fits into that and is actually pulling it via fetch. So fetch is being used. I recommend start using it. It's the only thing that's fully compatible with service workers. And as we'll see later, it'll give you immense power over all your network requests. And in here, quick little snippet, terminated. You can terminate your own service workers. You very rarely do that, but the browser terminates, so there's certain hooks for that. Okay, first step, download. Seems kind of self-explanatory, but there is actually a little bit here. Safety checks, obviously. This is a plain HTML file that gets delivered down to our client. We have a script tag in here that checks to see if they support service workers. And if they do, we basically re-register a service worker. We register this file to the browser as a service worker. It's very important so that the browser knows that, hey, this is a service worker. And it's very much promise-based. So if you have any experience with promises, this is a breeze. If you don't, it's probably about time you catch up with it. But it's a 100% promise-based, and it's really nice in that sense. And like I said, it does error, but it errors pretty silently. So it's not usually an issue for us in terms of breaking our application, unless you have code in there that you are dependent on. Secondly, install. So after a download, we have to install, and this is actually a very important hook. This is the service worker right here. You have a simple self.add event listener for install. This is where maybe you want to create some some cache folders, not really folders, but groupings for cache. And we'll get a little bit more into that. But this is kind of the core of the very beginning of when your service worker comes online in the background of your application. Probably more importantly, activate. So what's very interesting about the browser, you can only have one service worker going at a time. And that didn't used to be the case for web workers. If anyone's used web workers, you could have multiple, but how many was a whole nother story. But with service workers, you can only have one. And it's very likely that your browser is running one, installs a new one, but doesn't activate. As soon as it activates, it's killed the other one. So this is a very important hook to kind of understand any more due diligence that you need to do, that this service worker is actually running. Do I need to start doing some things that I want it to take care of? I'm being very ambiguous with this on purpose because service workers are amazing, and I don't want to just tell you that there's one blanket way to use them. There's a million ways to use them. I'll give you some examples later, but bear with me for the very broad functionality. And so I put some console logs in our service worker lifecycle, and it looks something like this. It installs and activates, pretty predictable, right? If I were to refresh this screen and I didn't have it update, it was just normal, like as if it was in production, it would already be installed. It would already be activated. So none of these hooks would actually run. So that's something service workers does. They're very persistent. They're obviously not immediate because the browser will kill them. Usually the browser kills them when you close any tabs under the domain. Usually is probably the best term for that because, again, they're a little bit unpredictable sometimes. But it's good to know that as soon as you get your first registration, you see an install and an active. And they give you an event, so you can see a lot of things about the event. I say definitely check that out, at least get this far. It's very simple to get over here. Debugging. This is the worst part of a service worker, right? It's like this idea of you have code that runs, and it doesn't necessarily need to be as fresh as your app was. So it causes a lot of issues. Chrome is doing a lot of really great stuff for this, but you have to understand the concept of a service worker to understand that the potential problems, right? That it's just sitting there. It could live there forever. So really, it comes to the browser decides when to install and activate the new service. There's certain ways that we can force that in terms of development. There's also some more crafty ways in production that you can do it. We're not going to cover those, but talk to me after and I'll tell you if you're really interested. But it's a new strategy because people might have issues, right? Like they might experience a situation where there's an old service worker that's just persistent. It's just staying there. And they're calling you and saying, I'm having all these issues. And you know deep down inside it's probably the service worker. There's certain ways to send commands to that service worker to kill it and start a new one. But you do have to kind of write that infrastructure. You have to something you have to take care of. Secondly, like I've been saying, the theme of this is do not rely on service workers always being there. They're really awesome. They're a great helper, but they're not someone you can count on, right? And lastly, I had to put this in here. Failed installs are the worst thing to debug. They don't debug through most of Chrome's normal tools. They have supplied this link. You can look it up, but if you ever get into the issue where you're debugging a failed install, that's a URL you want to go to, and you can actually step through as it goes. You can debug through the service worker as it's starting up. The normal tools that I'll show you later, they don't even have this in there. So kind of that good to know before you get started. Cool, so this is Chrome DevTools. Has anyone seen the application tab on Chrome DevTools? I hope so. It's got a lot of great stuff, local storage, IndexedDB. But service workers. So start checking out some of your more frequent sites. Netflix and any news sites typically have service workers right now. You'll see them. And you can see them running. So this is a good active case. This is, we loaded it at this time. It was 4:17, about the time when I was putting these slides together today. And it activated and is running. So at this time, I could be updating my app. It could be on Babel or Webpack, and it could be rebuilding. And I could be updating a new app, but the service worker is persistent. It's just staying there. No matter if I updated the code or not, application. But there's some really important, cool things here. These checkboxes up top, I have update on reload. That is a dev environment checkbox. That lets you load a new one every time that you refresh the page. Probably the single most important development environment checkbox that needs to be checked in the history of mankind right there, okay? If that doesn't work, up on the right, there's a bunch of commands, but there's unregister. That is your ultimate kill switch. Kill it, remove it, there's no service worker anymore. And then when you refresh, if your code has it, you'll install a new one and you're good to go. It's very important that you follow this screen closely when you're dealing with service workers. You'll regret not doing it. But it's really cool because you can understand the life of a service worker much better. Cool, some examples. Okay, this is the bread and butter of service workers, all right? Like, it has all this cool functionality, but how can I actually use it? The reality of that is, my favorite one and the most frequently used one is offline capabilities. This idea that you pass all your HTTP requests through this proxy, basically through your service worker, before they go out to your backend server. Your service worker can decide if it wants to check its cache and dish out a cache version that it has saved on your machine or the user's machine and use that, or request to the server. So it gives you a lot of opportunities because you can get it when it's going out. You can also get it when it's coming back. So imagine a situation where you're making a request and the server's not responding. Hopefully you wrote some code way back when you first got some information that has cached this locally on the machine. And you can deliver that. So now we don't have RESTful APIs that, they might be getting the same information, or they might be getting cache information from the server, but if they can't reach the server, it's useless, right? So it keeps a local cache. And this is not app cache. App cache is dying a very slow and painful death, but this is the cache API. And I recommend you guys look into it. It's a really key value pair way of storing requests and responses so that you do have that fallback, right? Now, there's a ton of caching strategies. I opted not to get involved in this because it's a rabbit hole and I don't know, people might start brawling. It is anyone's best guess which is the best caching strategy, but why I say it's mostly offline capability, because at some point you do have to get that information, right? You have to get that information from the API, but hopefully you get it once and you always have some kind of copy in case things go south. You can do this for images. You can do this for any assets, any JavaScript files. You can do this for JSON data from a RESTful API. You name it. Fetch does every network request in the browser. So that's why I mentioned earlier that working in Chrome, everything's working on Fetch already. So some cool applications that I've seen are these ideas of having cached fallback images. If you can't load an image, you have a placeholder image that works well for it. And that's really great on mobile, especially on really bad connectivity. And there's a million other use cases, but this is the most popular by far. And the cool part is it's just a hook, really. Once you've registered your service worker, you can add an event listener called fetch. Anytime it receives any assets, now it's kind of a catch-all, right? You can decide if you want, just let it keep going. But if you didn't want it to keep going, you can call this event called event.respondWith. You give it a promise, and essentially you can decide if you're going to grab from the cache or if you're going to do something crazy or do a fallback image, you name it. But this is a single hook. Now, obviously, writing code for every fetch request in one hook could be a nightmare. Tread lightly there. There's a lot of really great practices. It's really just about abstraction, right? Like take your code out, only have simple readable function calls in there, but you can easily create some kind of functionality to determine what you're working with, whether it be an image or JSON data, HTML. I wouldn't do HTML, but in that case you could, right? It's up to you, which is awesome, but incredibly dangerous if you're not guided well. Cool, so here is a cool example from Twilio of the feel of an offline application. Who here understands progressive web apps, or at least has done some research in progressive web apps? I recommend, I hate to say it, but jump on the bandwagon, at least see what progressive web apps are talking about. They bring a lot of value, and I think it's something that's going to continue to evolve, but they change the way that we handle web applications, because the internet before mobile applications was pretty lame, right? We just basically served up static HTML files. And then mobile apps came along, and we got these push notifications. We got more offline use, and we got this background sync where the app was more workable by itself, even without internet, if coded correctly. Now the internet's saying, hey, like, this is cool. We know the direction that we need to head. We know what we need to do. And progressive web apps, the whole movement is trying to pick that speed up. And of course, a website is typically better than a mobile app, right? We're not installing. I'm not trying to sell this whole progressive web app thing, but it's turning into that. We don't have to install it. We can push out updates rather quickly, the whole deal. But this is the case where it's from Twilio, but they're really jumping on this where they're giving you the option where they're turning Wi-Fi off, and then as soon as the connection comes back, anything that you were doing before gets synced. Background sync gets pushed out. Very powerful, and you can see the user doesn't even know. It's not applicable for everything, and it depends how dangerous you're willing to get with it, but it's a really cool concept. Background sync, very similar to this. This is the idea that we are holding on to all those things and pushing them up. Same thing, one hook, right? You can call this from your code base through the browser to sync a specific event tag, whatever tag you want to call it, and it will run some code on your service worker that you wrote that will possibly sync. It'll find the outdated versus the things that have been sent to the server successfully, and you can write the logic to decide to update the server. Background sync is, to me, very new, very powerful, also very dangerous, of course, because if you mess it up, it's a poor user experience. But very powerful, especially in terms of web, right? And lastly, it's cool to me, but push notifications, right? The user has to allow these, but web push is a technology that works really well with service workers. It can sit in the background in your web application. If a user subscribed, allowed push notifications in the browser for your website, it can sit there as almost like a listener and take those events, and then it can actually communicate with your main app through messaging. There's a messaging protocol, and then your main app can decide what to do with it. Very powerful in terms of feeling like a mobile app, and service workers give you that option without running that in your main thread, right? You're not just like doing this check, or you're having something that's kind of hogging a lot of the main CPU. Push notifications, again, you guys are seeing the theme. It's a hook, right? It's a simple hook. It's a global hook for your service worker. And you decide what you want to do with it. The future, this is obviously speculation. I'm very opinionated. Definitely not right a lot of the times, but I like to think I am. So the future, progressive web apps, right? Like, we're going to this age where like websites are going to be much better than they used to be. They're going to feel like a native app. You're going to add that mobile capability that makes them feel very robust, and they're not erroring out every time you're trying to load something. And there's been talks about periodic sync. Couldn't tell you too much about that specification, but service workers supporting it. So I'm assuming some kind of staged syncing process. And geofencing, which is very different. They're talking about adding that to service workers. They have not added it yet, though. And that's it. Hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions, or Slack or SacTech, right? Like I don't talk a lot on that, but I'm on Slack every day for work. Or hit me up after this for some questions. But I will take some general questions right now. So does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Do you think since you said debugging was like a hell for you?
Can be. You gotta. Yeah.
Do you think the implementation of a service worker outweighs the cost of like debugging it if something goes wrong?
No, I think debugging is difficult because it's so foreign to our development lifecycle. Like, we're used to in dealing with an application, service workers are very different. They're foreign to us, right? once you understand their concept and you know some fail safes and you know to like not trust the service worker when you're having issues, it's not that big of an issue. But you have to get to that point, right? So this is my like red flag, like warning you, don't take it for granted, because it's not like your normal application. But I'd say it's still worth it. Still absolutely worth it. The benefits outweigh some of the development pains. Anybody else? Cool. If you guys have any questions, like I said, talk to me after. Thanks.